Hi.
Hello, everybody. So it is just 12:30, so I'd love to go ahead and get started. Um, we have a great turnout here today. People will, I'm sure, continue to join. But I wanted to welcome everyone. Good afternoon to the Hood Museum of Art's second virtual public program. I'm Sharon Reed, the Programs and Events Coordinator for the Hood Museum of Art. And today we're pleased to bring you Conversations and Connections with Colleen Randall and Jeff Friedman. This program is provided in conjunction with the exhibition In the Midst of Something Splendid, which features abstract paintings on canvas and paper by Colleen, a well-respected member of the Dartmouth Studio Art faculty. I'd also like to acknowledge that this exhibition was generously supported by the Bernard R. Siskin Fund and the Eleanor Smith Fund. We're also pleased to host this program in celebration of National Poetry Month. Before we begin, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. There will be images shared during this program, as you see on the screen now, and to optimize your experience, if you see a green bar at the top of your screen that says Colleen is sharing her screen, to the right of that is a tab that reads Viewing Options. Just click on that and select the option that says Side by Side, and this will prevent the images from overlapping with the speakers. We'll begin by introducing our speakers and hearing briefly from them about what they do. Then our moderator will pose a couple of questions for them, after which we'll open up to questions from all of you. You may type a question at any time in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can during the time that we have here today. We do ask that you refrain from raising your hand. That will help us to expedite your questions. The program is being recorded, and we will share a link on the Hood social media platforms in the near future. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Katherine Hart. Katherine is the Senior Collections Curator and Barbara C. and Harvey P. Hood, 1918 Curator of Academic Programming at the Hood Museum of Art. She and John Stomberg, Virginia Rice Kelsey, 1961 S. Director, are co-curators of the exhibition. Kathy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sharon, and good afternoon and welcome. Colleen Randall and Jeff Friedman have been married now for almost 45 years. This conversation is intended to delve into the personal and working relationship of these two artists, nothing too personal, whose art is based on two distinctly different mediums. What we hope to do today is to ask about how their relationship and artistic lives have intertwined and how they've influenced each other's work and perspective on artistic expression. Jeff Friedman teaches at Keene State College and has published 8 volumes of poetry and published in numerous anthologies and journals. His upcoming book of poetry, The Marksman, will be released in the fall of 2020. Friedman has received numerous awards and prizes, including a National Endowment Literature Translation Fellowship in 2016 and 2 individual artist grants from the New Hampshire Arts Council. Colleen Randall has taught in the studio art department at Dartmouth College since 1989, and her most recent exhibition, In the Midst of Something Splendid, opened at the Hood Museum in January of this year. While the reopening date of the museum is still uncertain, we planned for the show to be on view through the summer, so we hope you will have a chance to see it before it closes for those of you who are local. Colleen received her MFA in painting from Queens College, City University of New York, and has had solo exhibitions at commercial galleries and alternative spaces throughout the country. She's a recipient of the National Academy of Design's Edwin Palmer Memorial Award for Painting, a Marion and Jasper Whiting Foundation Fellowship Grant, and an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Research Grant. She has had numerous artist residencies, including at Yaddo and the MacDowell Colony. Writing on the work of the poet Jeff Friedman, the poet Gerald Stearns said, "Jeff Friedman is a great liar and an even greater comedian. As a liar, he remembers everything and nothing from the last 2,000 years. As a comedian, he knows hyperbole, pacing, irony, and all the others. He can't fool me, though. He's a true poet, and those are facades." Here is the artist and critic Nick Lamia writing on an exhibition of Colleen's painting. During her additive process, the dramatic weight and volume of the paint itself becomes the most important aspect of the works. In a surprising twist, the massive pigment load and heavy textures often become atmospheric and made more surprising by the fact it imparts the works with a feeling of spirituality. The beauty and impact of her most successful works grows in parity with the amount of paint applied. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Colleen and Jeff, who will each speak about their work for about 10 minutes total, and then we will get to the questions. So handing it over to you, Colleen.
Okay, I think Jeff is going to go first. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go first. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about myself. And I want to first, though, thank Kathy and Sharon for inviting us to talk to everybody, and also for letting us just take a look again at this incredible exhibition by Colleen. So thank you very much. And actually, Sharon, thank you for hand-holding me through getting on the Zumba session. So it seems like that was like traumatic for me, even though I've been working with it for a while. So thanks again. I was born in Chicago and lived there for several years before my family picked up, and as it sounds like we've been married for 45 years, picked up and moved by covered wagon to St. Louis. And that's where I grew up, sort of right under the arch. When I was very young in grade school, I would be sentenced to an old janitor's closet for talking in class, or for maybe just having too much energy. The janitor's closet housed the school library, which contained mostly myths, fables, and tales. I read all the books in the library, and many more than a few times. While in exile from my classmates, I actually began writing fables and brief tales of my own. I met Colleen in 1972 while visiting a close friend in Minneapolis, but I didn't see her again until the late fall of '73, and we moved in together only a few months later, if it was that long. In college, I intended to become a fiction writer, but I studied with two phenomenal poets and teachers, Howard Schwartz at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, before I knew Colleen, and Larry Levis at the University of Missouri in Columbia after Colleen and I were married. When I met Levis, I was working the graveyard shift in a nursing home and didn't really have time to write short stories. So instead, I wrote brief stories and lines that I began showing to Levis, though I was not officially enrolled in college. He encouraged me to keep writing poems, and so I did. Eventually, I was admitted to the Iowa Writers Workshop and awarded a teaching writing fellowship. Colleen and I moved to Iowa City, and I received my MFA in 1980. For many years, I wrote free verse poems that explored the sadness and heartbreak of the American dream in the context of family and working life, often connecting the stories of contemporary life with biblical stories, particularly from Genesis. The poems had an autobiographical impulse, though I certainly felt free to fictionalize, and many poems wove together different strands of time into a single lyrical narrative framework. And I thought I might just read a short passage just to give you an idea of where I was starting. And this is from a poem called Two Salesmen. And my father was a salesman and my uncle was a salesman, so referring to them. And it takes place in the fall of 1961 on a Sunday night. Work hard, my Uncle Harold says, and you'll get somewhere, boy. And my father nods his head, of black curly hair. With drinks cradled in their hands, they sit side by side on two throne-shaped swivel chairs, staring at the small black screen set in the tan console, carved wood doors pinned back against blonde wood. So that sort of gives you an idea of the detail and the particularity of the kind of work I was doing then. But in the last 20 years, and since moving to West Lebanon, I've been writing prose poems, tales, fables, parables, sort of that goes back to my beginnings in childhood with what I was writing, that tackle many of the same subjects. But the eye of the poem now has become fictional, and the settings are no longer specifically detailed the way they might have been in a poem, let's say, about working in a factory in St. Louis. Instead, I would say the settings are probably a kind of fictionalized version of downtown West Lebanon with trick names like Main Street. These prose pieces that I've been working on have allowed me more freedom to speak in my own voice and in different voices. It's also allowed me to employ a broader range of comedy and humor in my work, influenced by the great Jewish comedians I grew up with. So I'd like to just take a minute and read a poem from a more recent thing set here. And it's kind of a bear love story called Bear Fight. And I think I probably don't need to explain that bears huff because probably everybody's so familiar with bears around here. Okay, so I'm just gonna read it. When Liza fell in with a bear, I was more than disappointed, as I had been in love with her since childhood. What's he got that I don't? I asked as we walked past the diner together. He's a bear, she said. She let go of my hand. He gets a little jealous when I'm out with my friends. Why do you want to be with a bear anyway? I asked. Two teenagers pushed past us with their skateboards. Balloons floated above Main Street, announcing a sale at the furniture shop. Why do you want to be with me? She asked. We parted ways when the light changed, but later I went to her home dressed as a bear. She opened the door. Come in, she said, putting her arms around me. You don't smell like a bear, she said. Then in walked the bear with a fierce look on his face. He growled, and so did I. He cuffed me, so I cuffed him back. Then we grappled with each other, bear hugging, until Liza stepped in between us and held out her hands. I'm sick of bears, she said. Get out of here. I ripped off my bear mask. I'm not a bear, I said. The bear ripped off his. I quit this game, he said. I'm not a bear either. Liza removed her mask, and she wasn't Liza. We ran away as fast as we could. I made it back to my place and locked the door, turning on the outside light. But all night, I heard her huffing. Thank you. So take it, Colleen.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Sharon and Kathy, for your introductions and for getting us here and up and functioning. And thanks to everyone at the Hood for the production, and to John for co-curating with Kathy. It's been great having the show up, and I'm so thrilled that if we open up in the summer, it will still be on view. So thank you all. Just give a little personal background about me. I'm from Minnesota, and as a college undergraduate way back in the early 1970s, I visited New York City for the first time. And it was through becoming acquainted with the collection of modern and contemporary paintings at MoMA, and also seeing all the artists who were living and working there, and the energy and excitement of the place, that inspired my ambition and dream to pursue a career as an artist. I took studio classes in drawing and ceramics at Macalester College, where Jeff was also studying and writing seriously. And I was making mostly hand-built wall pieces and forms. But it was at that time that we began the practice of relying on one another for honest feedback, as well as encouragement and support. For the next couple of years, I worked at various jobs, such as picture framing, and began taking painting classes at the University of Missouri, where Jeff was studying poetry with Larry Levis. And I attended an artist lecture there by Elaine de Kooning. She was one of just a handful of women painters I was aware of at the time, and probably the first one I heard talk about her own work. She really impressed me and reinforced my ambition to study painting in New York City. Eventually, after completing a BFA in painting at the University of Iowa, I did find my way to Queens College in the City University of New York, where I earned my MFA in 1983. It was at Queens College that I met painters and mentors such as Rosemary Beck and Harry Kramer, as well as many of the younger artists who came to form the community of colleagues and friends who I stay in touch with and who still nourish my creative life. I spent most of the 1980s in New York City, where we lived in Williamsburg, and I worked in a studio at Concalba House on 2nd Street and Avenue B. While there, I immersed myself in the community of artists in the city in New York and began to discover who I was as an artist. during that time in the 80s, I was working with mixed media, and I'd often start out with acrylic drawings collaged to canvas as an underpainting, and then build up the surfaces with layers of oil mixed with sawdust, marble dust, and wax. In 1989, I began teaching in the studio art department at Dartmouth, and Jeff and I commuted between New York City and Hanover for a couple years until I convinced Jeff to move and join me in the Upper Valley, where we've been working and pursuing our careers since then. I've always been enthralled with the possibilities of making paintings that are independent of conformity to the appearances of the world, but that are still rooted in experience. When I began to think about putting this show together, the political turmoil of the last presidential election was in full swing. I asked myself what I could do as an artist to respond. And I wanted to remind people of how important art is to maintaining our faith in humanity. I decided I wanted to celebrate the sacred space that imagination inhabits in all our lives, and the healing power of immersing oneself in the sensations of light and color. It was really the impetus for how this show, in the midst of something splendid, came about. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. You're muted, Kathy. I think you're still on mute.
Yes, I'm now not on mute. Thank you very much. That's one of the things in Zoom you have to be careful about, obviously. Okay, back online. So now I'm going to ask just a few questions, and then we're going to turn it over. Sharon's going to be our moderator for the questions after I ask mine. But my first question for you has to do with beginnings. After you met and got to know each other, how did you come to understand each other's medium, either poetry or painting? And how did that understanding evolve?
Colleen,
you want to go first, Jeff?
Yeah, I'll go first. And you can interrupt me anytime you want.
Well, that's a big permission. Everybody, you're witness to that.
Yes. Well, so when I first met Colleen, she was a ceramicist, actually. And the thing is, my experience with ceramics was like, you know, these kind of functional pieces, and I knew enough to go up and feel the lip of the you know, and go, this is nicely formed. But she was never interested in the functionality of her ceramics. They were always kind of sculptural shapes and abstract in their own way. And then when she took up painting, when she began painting, she started abstractly. She was always an abstract painter, and it really was quite a struggle because all of her teachers, at least early on, all of her teachers were representational and also male for the most part, until she got to Queen's College, where she found some abstract painters and female artists to work with, Rosemary Beck. So I think, you know, when we first were together, I was in the opposite end of it because she was an abstract artist, and I was doing just really the actually opposite of that because I was a storyteller and concerned with particularity and detail all the time. You know, more detail the better in my mind. And I think it's funny because coming at it from different extremes, I think to some extent you can sometimes see things in the other's work, you know, like where I could kind of see sometimes, I think, where the abstraction might be unanchored, and she could see where I couldn't see the forest through the details, so to speak, or where my details were getting to be too many. So I think we offered, like, each other pretty good criticism along those lines at that point. And then also, I think underneath it, I was trying to capture through details and storytelling a kind of spirit or some kind of feeling or emotion at the center of it. And she was actually trying to do that in her own way through the primacy of paint. So there was some...
Wow, I'm going to interrupt you.
Oh, please do.
I think I define myself as an object maker. So the physicality of the object is a really important thing, and being in the presence of the object is really an important thing. And you know, I remember from that time just talking a lot, reading, visiting galleries and museums, and you know, I started attending readings, and you'd come to exhibitions with me, and we did a lot of critiquing one another's work. And I remember you, I listened to hours and hours of comedy albums.
I actually sort of forced you to do,
which was completely new for me. And I really didn't know what to make of it, actually. But
so I kind of made everybody, people would come in and I'd make them sit and listen to a whole comedy album. It's true enough. And Colleen had to listen to all of them, you know, that I had. Like Mel
but
Brooks.
you know, you wrote all the time, and I developed the discipline and daily practice of going to the studio. And I think that was really, you know, those were the years that we ingrained that into our lives and our living pattern. And we did things like, I remember at the Met, one year we went to the Met once a week. And I think, Jeff, you said you remembered we went 37 out of 52 weeks. And we'd go to a different part of the Met and study and talk about the objects. And then at home during the week, we would read some book list you would come up with of the classics or something, you know, Greek and Roman or something. And that was just really fun. And so what my point was about being a physical object maker, being in New York was really important. And because we didn't have the financial resources to travel a lot at the time. And we knew that being there, more art would pass through than any other location at the time. I don't know if that's still true though.
Well, I mean, you know, yeah, I think that's, you know, you actually, you know, I was sort of somebody who wanted to move to New York. I remember that, and we did move to New York, and it was quite an education going to the Met all that time. I mean, I think it's sort of what I learned about art just by going every week and seeing all those things was sort of incredible. Something to have happen. I'll never forget. I can still have the images sort of plastered in my mind somewhere, you know, in different places, like of the things we saw. I think we've exhausted that question, haven't we?
I did ask how things have evolved in terms of your understanding of each other's media.
Did we not
I don't know if you want to address that.
Oh, sure. Do you want to speak first this time, Colleen? Because I jumped in so peremptorily.
I'll try to get a word in here. Well, I feel we've gotten closer and closer together, and I've learned so many things. I think the content of my paintings has widened, and for a lot of reasons, but also working with Jeff. I think, you know, coming out of New York School abstract expressionism, it takes a while to give yourself permission, I think, to change things and do things differently. And I think I'm just a lot broader in my appreciation and understanding of where poetry and art comes from and the forms it can take. How about you?
Well, you know, I think at the beginning, I mean, if you want to talk about the evolution just a little bit, I mean, I used to see your paintings and sort of try to like put them together with what I was doing and thinking and trying to see, you know, this angle. And as time rolled on, I began to really get much more absorbed in understanding how paint worked itself. I don't think you know, just how that could be, just like language, that could be, you know, they could have its own language.
It is a language, yeah, of its own.
And, you know, and your canvases changed so much because there was so much more paint on the surfaces. I also got to be stronger because I had to move those paintings many times over the years, and they were heavy with paint. So I feel like I evolved in that way.
And now we're too old to do that very much.
Not too old. But I thought, you know, I think just the understanding of what the materials were doing, and then it's funny because I think we're closer together as what artists are doing now. So our work has intersected more over the years. So it's actually, we've come from different angles, and I wouldn't say we're doing the same thing at all, but there's more. If we're going to draw like a Venn diagram, there would be more intersecting points, certainly, than when we first started. Because I think as artists and as critics, we were really coming at it from totally different angles to start with, but not so much. Now we've kind of moved together. Does that kind of answer that question?
Yeah, that answers that question. And this leads to the next one, which is a little bit more specific about the intersection of your artistic lives. For instance, the Hood owns 2 paintings by Colleen, and the titles come from Emily Dickinson poems. So if you could talk maybe and also give some examples about that type of intersection that I have seen, particularly in Colleen's work, because I'm a bit closer to that. So, yeah. So, how do lives intersect?
I'll start, I guess. I don't title my paintings until after they're finished, and I can more fully recognize the content of what I've done. It takes me a while to really see them, and I often look for words or phrases taken from poems that somehow enhance the imaginative experience for the viewer, rather than attempt to try to describe the painting or somehow limit that visual experience. So the paintings you're referring to were lines taken from Emily Dickinson. And in this show, in the midst of something special, splendid, Jeff and I worked together, and I took phrases from many of his poems to use for titles of the paintings. Did you? That's one way. I don't know if this is what you meant as much, but I think artists are always having to buy time to do their work, because it's not something you have to make time for yourself, because no one else is going to grant it to you or give you that time. So we worked really hard to learn to be respectful of one another's work, space, and routine over the years. And that's created an interesting kind of daily lifestyle that's evolved over all this time together. Jeff works very early in the morning. He gets up at 4 or 5, and I wake more like a normal person. And I'm more of a midday worker, so that affects how we schedule entertainment, meals, all those things, but we've really adjusted. And other artists have other complicated lives. They have children to raise. We've always had to have jobs. And so we've been supportive and intersecting, I think, on every level. And it kind of works its way through. So I think we're getting better at it. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, there's a couple of things in there. I mean, I was sort of thinking about, Oliver Sacks has a statement in what is most in River of Consciousness about fallible memory, and how sometimes your most intense or vivid memories are some memory that someone else actually has told you. It wasn't actually your memory or something. And I think being so kind of close together at different times, it's interesting. I've noticed over the years our stories and like me reading poems, and we've kind of assumed each other's memories without really realizing, like at different times, like with the Emily Dickinson poems, you picked up a lot of stuff, I think, because I would read it aloud so much at different times. And I think all of a sudden it became you all of a sudden you could hear it going through your head.
Into my consciousness.
Your consciousness would sort of then, and I think I some of that, some of your, a lot of stuff from you. So I think in a way, like we were kind of sharing consciousnesses at different times. And it's sometimes when I'm telling a story, I realize I'm embellishing some story I heard about Colleen's family, and acting as if it happened in mine. And I can hear her saying things sometimes that actually she didn't go to, that that happened to me, but she's telling the story. I'm going, well, you did a good job on that story, I gotta say. So I think to some extent there's been this kind of, intersection permeating of consciousnesses that have played a good part in it. But the next thing you brought up had to do with, I think, our working procedures. I think I'm hard to live with because, I go to sleep late and I wake up earlier, and I'm kind of like, yeah. I mean, because I realized, like, early in the morning, she would get up at 7, and I had to teach myself not to start reading or something I had just written, like my draft or something, you know what I mean? Because I'd be like, I have to read my draft, then I had to get used to, like, when she'd go to the studio, she wouldn't want to be interrupted. And so I got that. So there were little different things. But then Colleen, on the other side of it, for many years, I just worked in bed. We lived in New York in this small apartment, and I would just have a college ruled notebook, and I'd write it by hand and then eventually type it when I got to a draft stage. And I think, for a long time, like, she'd get up and to look like I was conscious of what was going on, and she'd start talking to me, and and then she began to realize I was actually working, even though I seemed to be responding.
Yeah, and so, before I could afford a studio, I would try to work at home really early on. And I remember having a palette of oil paint in the kitchen one time, and then the phone cord dragging through it, and you trying to make a phone call. And so we learned that, it was better for me to have a workspace.
Well, yeah, I was
away
always
from your workspace.
Remember, I was choking with asthma as you dragged your cord through the paint and falling over and collapsing and kind of going, oh dear, keep working though.
Well, the other thing that I think I'm really grateful for is all the people we've brought into one another's lives, because over the years, artists, all of us build communities of friends and fellow artists, and who have a history and who you can trust to give you the truth and give you feedback. And there's just so many of those people that I consider friends that I would never have known if it weren't for you, So it's really enriched our artist community of friends and family.
Yeah. Well, we're about at the half point in the program, maybe a little over. So I thought maybe that would be a good time to hand it over to questions. Sharon, do we have some questions from people who are have joined us?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions. These kind of go together, and they're for Colleen. So the first part of the question is, has your work always been abstract? And was that a decision that you made from the beginning, or did it happen naturally? And the second part of that is, despite the fact that your art is abstract, it feels like it's telling a story. And do you have any stories behind your artwork, which I think plays back into what you and Jeff were talking about, sharing consciousness?
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's interesting. I will tell my version of those answers, and then Jeff, you can chime in and tell me if I'm misremembering or remembering something in an incorrect way. But yes, I have always painted abstractly, and I think it was just the work I responded to intuitively, and what I aspired to understand and be good at, but also the teachers I studied with, whether you painted abstractly or representationally, it wasn't really divided that way. People approached your work through formal language, and through the structure, through the composition, through all the formal elements of language. So I right from the start, I was thinking of painting and drawing as a language to learn, more primary than it being a subject matter per se. And I think I probably didn't recognize that I was telling stories, or I resisted coming up with them until maybe the last 15, 20 years or something like that. And I've just been able to be more aware of where the sources are. Like when I went to Rome to study the wall paintings for the House of Livia, those really influenced the content and the color of the, not so much the imagery, but a lot of other elements. Is that, would you have anything to that, Jeff?
Well, I mean, I think that question was for you. I think I said at the beginning that you always painted abstractly.
Uh-huh.
I don't think underneath it you were, I mean, to some extent, I guess the brush strokes on they kind of tell a story, actually. The way that they move across the canvas, there's kind of something going on there. You know, and yeah, there is, well, there definitely is.
Jeff, I think, okay.
Pardon me?
The other thing I could say, maybe story-wise, with this body of work, you know, was more about dealing with the political situation in our country and in the world right now. And, you know, being a teacher and seeing students who are really struggling with who to be and where to, what to do with their lives and how to find something of value to make careers out of. And I remembered so much going through that in the 1970s with the Vietnam War and everything that was going on. And I thought how great it was for me to come across teachers and mentors who had committed themselves to their work, sometimes under really difficult situations. And I just thought to celebrate making art as a role model and to really show that in my work and embody that. So maybe that's the kind of stories I tell. They're not so personal.
More of an implicit story.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
One of the things I was going to say is one of the things I realized when I was looking at that, the Emily Dickinson Hour of Lead and When the Windows Failed. Those two paintings, I got the feeling that you were trying to achieve something that goes beyond words, but in some way also goes beyond how something is expressed in a very sort of systematic way, but more something out of something felt. So in also talking about the idea of stories, the way poetry can evoke something without actually describing the exact thing, the way words are used is sort of associative. And I felt that when I was looking at those paintings, especially with the titling relating to a poem, that they were both getting at something having to do with a profound moment in a human experience or emotion that is not descriptive. It's not narrative, but it sort of stands in for that. So that's sort of something I noticed a little bit. So how that works.
It's beautiful. I think it's hard for an artist to say that about their own work. And Jeff and I were talking about how both poetry and painting are attempts to express the inexpressible.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely.
Well, I think those, you know, I remember that I'm remembering the paintings that you actually had those, and I think I brought in the Emily Dickinson poems into like This is the Hour of Lead, and there's a certain slant of light, wet winter afternoons that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. There in that opening, there's a kind of like that sense of what you're just talking about, this feeling, the slant of light or the hour of lead, or I couldn't have the windows filled, I could not see to see. Like, so the conversation I began about her with her in discussing that was to kind of bring those in and those poems into her studio in a way. And then I guess we both began thinking about them in terms of her paintings, because they really seem to kind of fit. And I've always had this idea that, with titles, they don't necessarily, they shouldn't necessarily be labels. And sometimes they don't even have to, they can go in a different direction than the piece you're taking. So the mind can the mind can move. And actually the title can actually run parallel to it in a lot of ways. But I really do think that those Dickinson lines really did express something about her work. There was a kind of thing that was really, the paintings kind of had that feeling in there. They're not, you kind of feel like there's something there behind it that is there, but you can't like put your finger on a particular place or whatever it is, but the whole complex of emotion is there underneath it all, right?
Also, I think it gives, keeping them abstract gives the audience access to make that that feeling their own, to connect it with something personal to them, rather than trying to have to interpret a specific incident that happened to someone else and relate it. So it's creating kind of a world for the viewer to enter and make their own, hopefully.
Yeah, but there were other, you brought in other people into your, like Catherine Clement with your syncope pieces. And like you said, the Livia's walls, the garden, those Roman garden paintings, they all became part of your vocabulary and the story of the completion of your painting. So there were certainly these other, other kinds of things.
And you brought to my attention the Taxi poem by Russell Edson that I used a line from that poem. I realized I was in the midst of something splendid for the title of the show. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess. Yes, I did.
So Sharon, should we put forth another question from?
Yeah, we have a couple more questions here in the queue. This question is for both Colleen and Jeff. And I know you've just touched upon this in this last bit, but they're wondering where your inspiration comes from and how do you think the more metropolitan New York City affects your art compared to being in New Hampshire, in a place where you're surrounded by nature?
See, I think our tactic on answering questions is to just keep going until everybody forgets the question.
Start on that, Jeff, while it's still
sure.
In your mind.
I will start on that because I think that's probably an easier question for me to answer in a lot of ways. I was so urban. I grew up like, I was born in Chicago, lived in St. Louis, Minneapolis, and then New York. Although in between, I lived in some small towns in the Midwest, but I was really involved with, like the subway and the place in Brooklyn I lived and capturing that. And since I moved up here, a whole different relationship to place has come about. Like I said, like the West Lebanon that I'm capturing, it could be anywhere in a way. It's a main street. And I began doing these, like I mentioned earlier, kind of these tale-like pieces, and I've gotten more I think in a way I've gotten more abstract, but also more narrative at the same time, if that's possible. I mean, it's probably a contradiction there, but I've moved away from lineated poems pretty much, and I'm writing now in this way I'm talking about, in prose passages. And I feel like that I no longer really, I moved away, like I said earlier, from the autobiographical I, which is somewhat fictional anyway, to a kind of everyman in a sense, who's, beleaguered by what's going on around him, so I guess that's really the level of intensity and the kind of detail has really changed since I moved up here. It took me quite a long time to get some sense of place, the sense of place here, because I wasn't, like how it worked in my mind. But I think I finally got some relationship to that. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
That's a really interesting question because I think about it all the time and wonder, but I grew up in a really small town, not that dissimilar from the Upper Valley. So it wasn't as big an adjustment for me to move out of the city. For Jeff, it took a really long time. And, he loves to walk. And so he used to walk for hours and hours in the city. We both did. And now he's taken to walking hours and hours through town and all around the paths and everywhere around here. But I think that I've always been interested in the reconciliation of opposites, and that when I was in urban settings, as a young person, I didn't miss nature as much. It was still really imprinted. And so I think it manifested itself in my use of materials, because I was always putting together something raw with something fragile, something smooth with something rough. And I still do that more. I think also the palette was derived more from urban landscape, wasn't quite so naturalistic, or maybe as maybe some of the color is now. But the more I paint, the more I really realize how connected I am to nature in my subject matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's funny, you've gone back and forth between saying just the opposite about being connected, like you didn't want an attachment, but yeah, there's a real connection. I find that when I was commuting up here from New York, going back and forth, I was here, I guess, 3 days a week and there 4 days a week. And I'd sort of put my New York face on down there on the subway, like, don't get near me. And then I'd come back up here and, the doors would be unlocked and we'd be walking. I sort of got the sense of dreaminess, and the walk sort of lead me into that kind of feel of, so I think my work has gotten dreamy in some ways, like dream is related. The idea of dreams, like creating pieces that have dream-like qualities to it. And I don't know, maybe a little bit of that is infused into your work as well, or at least a meditative quality.
Definitely more, it's more meditative, yeah.
Yeah, I'm more nervous than you.
Yeah, there was just much more, even in my work, it was much more loud, and it didn't have the same contemplative kind of feeling to it.
When you were in New York, yeah.
Yeah.
So another question, Sharon.
Yeah, another question. So we have someone who's remarking, I know we're all living through this sort of really challenging time in the life of the world right now. And some students are having a very hard time.
Can't hear you, Sharon.
Can you hear me now? They're wondering what message you might give to students right now who are having a hard time with everything going on, or what would you send back to your 18 to 20-year-old selves if you could?
Faith and hope. Things change. You have to work at it. But I don't think, I really empathize. I think it's very difficult to try to look at the world and the options available and feel like you can do something that you love and also survive and manage and cope and flourish. And for me, I found those role models in other artists, and I didn't know how to do it, but I just hung out and hung around and built a community of people, and we worked together and made it happen and did the best we could. And it's been a wonderful life to have been able to do that. So my message is, do what you love doing, and through ups and downs, that will sustain you. If you really love what you're doing, you will find a way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great message. I guess the first thing I'd say is I really think we have to get a new president and get out there and vote, get out there and vote for a new president. That would be one thing. And then the other thing is, I guess, in this particular time, I think when I was growing up, there was an idea of that there was more of a straight line to things, and like, you know, my father worked at one job for a long time, and a lot of the fathers I knew, they might have switched after a while, but they stayed. And I think right now, nothing is a straight line. You know, you have to kind of go for what you want, but you have to understand you might have to take different detours and routes, but just to sort of hang in there and, you know, find those different people that can help you get to where you want to go. And just keep at it. I mean, I think that's a big difference. Like, if you think, I mean, everybody, the odds are and whenever you say something, if you want to be an artist or you want to be a filmmaker, the typical thing is like, the odds are always against you in doing that. And most people, you know, sort of give you the advice that, you know, well, God, that's going to be really tough. How are you going to support? And I think the thing is, if you think you're not going to be able to do it, you're not going to be able to do it. So you have to always think that you are going to be able to do it. I mean, there is a point at which, you know, if you're like 96 and you're, you know, not able, you know, and you haven't like really written your first poem, you maybe shouldn't think of yourself as a poet at that point. But generally speaking, I mean, I think you gotta kind of, if you really want it, you really gotta go for it and think.
Well, that's what I loved. Your poem, How to Walk on Water.
Oh yeah.
It addresses that. I mean, I think as an artist, it's an act of faith. You know, you do not know how it's going to turn out, or even if you can do it, but you have to believe you can, and you have to have the people around you who support you and believe in you and will help you. You don't do it alone. That's one thing I found out.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people along the way that make it possible, you know, friends, family, professional colleagues, you know, and we always had jobs. We always had to have jobs. And I was always told, just no matter what you're doing, don't stop working. Find a way to keep in touch with it so you don't feel like it's totally impossible to get back to doing it.
And but you also point out, yeah, I mean, I think you need a community at all times. You should always, you know, who are the people you went to school with, or your friends. You need to build up a community of people who can give you feedback. And it may not even be somebody who's in your field, but somebody whose criticism, or who you understand what they're saying to you. That may be a person. For me, it doesn't have to be somebody who's a writer. It can be just somebody whose opinion I value and whose opinion I understand. I understand what they're responding to in my work, or what they aren't responding to in my work. So having a community around you in some way that you're interacting with is really important if you're going to be in the arts.
Yeah. In the time of we are in now, I just was talking to a class earlier, and they were saying there's all sorts of people doing creative and artistic things, though they are not label themselves as artists, but it's proliferating. And also artists are also offering on the web now, or on social media. So we seem to be in a particular time where people are going to the arts for comfort or for hope, or things like the things that you were saying.
Yeah.
It could be a really creative moment. You know, you're at a tipping point and you can drop into despair, or you can move over to like creativity. Let's think out of the box. Let's figure out a different way forward. And I really hope that we can do that together.
Yeah. Sharon, time for, I think, maybe one last question.
Yep, just enough time for one last question before concluding remarks from Colleen and Jeff. So we have an attendee wondering about your process of working, and it looks like this may be addressed to Colleen, but I think it's applicable to both. Do you have an overall final image or emotion in mind when you begin your work, or is it more of a process of recognition and following what you see happening at each stage?
I'm really process oriented. I definitely work until I start to center myself and focus myself. And I think Milton Resnick said, painting is about sustaining an emotion over time. So I kind of, you know, come to some realization of what it is I'm trying to embody, but the paintings can change dramatically. You know, I paint several paintings at the same time, and they begin to have a conversation and bounce off each other. So one might be dark or light or busy or windy or airy or something, and then one will take a whole nother personality. So they respond to each other, and it very much comes out of the process.
I think that was that Milton Resnick quote probably came out of Wordsworth, who said something like the spontaneous of overflow of emotion recollected in tranquility. So it's very close to that. Yeah, I think, I'm always interested in seeing how you build up one layer after another, because I come to your studio so many times and I'll look at it one day and it's one thing and I go, wow, that's great. You ought to just leave it there. And then I come back the next day, like actually I shouldn't say the next day, like 5 days later, and you've gone through all sorts of things and it's a whole different painting. So it's nice to see. I think I'm more improvisational in my approach to work. I think, I'm just kind of like, I don't know where I'm going from the beginning. I'm hoping, generally speaking, things have changed for me. I think I used to work towards ending on an image and then it became a sound. And I used to, and now I think more in terms of openings, like my pieces usually begin with some piece of dialogue maybe. So, kind of things have worked differently for me. So something's got to get me going. That's what it is, whether it's a piece of dialogue or whether it's something I'm remembering from the night before or something somebody else says, or even a phrase I'm reading. And then I kind of try to take off from there and see, where that draft leads me. And a lot of times it takes me a long time to finally finalize a poem, but I think the closer I am to the initial inspiration, the stronger it usually is. So, I feel like I have a lot of poems that come quicker, but then there are a lot that I just have to put aside and wait, and who knows how long they'll take. I have to find a way to look back into them and get that same creative impulse in revision, let's say, or in looking at them. So I'll stick with that.
Okay, I think what it is, we have 3 more minutes. So any concluding remarks? Has this conversation at all sort of made you think a little bit differently about your relationship, or is it, or as how has it been for you? Because I don't know, probably people don't ask you every day to talk about this subject.
No, I think I'm going to move. I'm in the basement and she's upstairs. I think I'm going to stay here and she's probably going to have to stay up there after this conversation.
It sort of feels like coming out, like we've been kind of in our own words. But I was wondering if Jeff would read the poem, Nothing, that I chose of his to put on the exhibition wall, and that related so much to my poem, my paintings. Do you think you would have time for that?
Yeah, that sounds like a great way to finish up. And after the poem's done, we'll say goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you.
So this is related to your painting, Gust of Light, which came out of this poem. So it's called Nothing. Nothing enters the room in a gust of wind, a falling light, a flaming shadow. Nothing grabs you by the shoulder, causing you to wince. Nothing prophesies nothing good for your future. In your case, nothing says, nothing is a bargain. Hold on to yourself as if you are holding on to nothing. Pretend that nothing exists and you won't be disappointed. Pretend that nothing doesn't exist and nothing will surprise you. Try to imagine nothing. Does it encircle you? Is it the sky empty of darkness and light and therefore empty of sky? When you embrace everything, nothing embraces you. Nothing rings a bell. Nothing deals the cards, plays all your hands. Nothing believes everything you say. Nothing touches you with its tenderness and tears. Nothing tells you what you want to hear. Nothing takes it all back and gives it to you again. Thank you.
And then I just wanted to show, this is a painting that I titled Gust of Light off of the line in that poem, Gust of Wind.
Okay.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you both. And Sharon, any final words? Thank you. It's just been great to listen to you guys talk to each other. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think
Thanks
we're all
for
virtual.
Having us. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. And I just wanted to thank you, Colleen and Jeff and Kathy, and all of you for joining us today. And ask that if you would please fill out the survey. You'll find the link in the chat box below. I think you can cut and paste the link if it's not live. We'll also be sending that out in a follow-up email if you don't get that from the chat box today. We appreciate all of your feedback. And we hope you're able to join us for our next program, which will be held on April 29th. That's a Wednesday at 12:30 again. And this time we'll hear from Director John Stomberg, and he's going to discuss mediated authenticity, art and experience now. And I wish you all a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.